They left, or they pulled back far enough that leaving and staying started to feel like the same thing. And you did the work, or you have been trying to. You have been rebuilding, reorienting, putting your life back in the direction of something that actually moves forward. Some days it has worked. Some days the absence has had a weight that no amount of understanding or forward momentum could fully offset. And then something shifted. Something small. A message that did not need to be sent. A reason to be in contact that was thin enough to see through if you were looking. A sudden reappearance that felt casual on the surface and loaded underneath. Or maybe nothing that concrete yet. Just a feeling. That particular feeling of someone circling, of presence at the edges, of something that is not quite contact, but is not quite absence either. And now you are here, trying to figure out what is real and what you are projecting, trying to understand whether what you are sensing is actually happening, or whether hope is doing what hope does, manufacturing signals out of noise because the alternative is too quiet to sit inside comfortably. Here is what you need to know. And it starts not with whether they are coming back. It starts with why. Because the why changes everything about what you do when they arrive. The hook is not an accident. There is a behavior pattern in avoidant attachment that almost never gets named directly. It gets described in pieces, the push-pull dynamic, the intermittent reinforcement, the hot and cold cycle, but the pieces rarely get assembled into the complete picture. So let's assemble it. An avoidant does not just pull away and disappear cleanly. That would actually be kinder, in a specific brutal way. A clean disappearance is a closed door. It is grief with a defined object. It is loss that has edges, and therefore loss that can eventually be processed and released. What avoidants do instead is pull away while leaving the door open, not wide open, just open enough. A like on something after weeks of silence, a message that is friendly but not explanatory, a response that is warm enough to reactivate the hope, but vague enough to require no real accountability. Contact that says, I am still here, without saying anything about what here means, or what they want, or what any of this is. That specific, calibrated, just enough contact is not random. It is not them being confused about what they want and accidentally sending mixed signals while they figure it out. It is the avoidant attachment system doing something very specific and very purposeful, even when the person doing it has no conscious awareness that it is happening. It is maintaining the hook. The hook is the state of sustained psychological investment you remain in when someone keeps the door open just far enough to prevent you from fully closing it on your end. It is the hope that stays alive because it keeps getting the minimum amount of oxygen required to survive. It is the part of you that cannot fully move on because moving on requires a finality that the other person keeps not providing. And the avoidant needs the hook, not out of cruelty, out of the same psychological architecture that drove everything else. The hook is their safety net. The assurance that if the defended life gets too empty, if the absence of real intimacy becomes too loud, if the reckoning builds to the point of action, there is somewhere to return to, someone who is still there, still warm, still invested enough to receive them. The hook is insurance against the full consequences of their own avoidance. What maintaining the hook actually looks like obvious manipulation. If it looked obvious, it would not work. It looks like this. After a period of distance, they resurface with something that requires just enough response to reopen the channel without requiring them to address anything real. A memory, a reference to something that only the two of you would understand. Something that activates the warmth of the shared history without putting anything on the table about what comes next. It looks like being available in a way that feels like progress, responding faster, being warmer, showing up in small ways that feel like movement toward you, but never quite crossing the threshold into actually addressing the distance that exists or the dynamic that created it. It looks like future-oriented warmth. References to things you should do together, places you should go, conversations you should have, generated with genuine feeling in the moment, sufficient to reactivate your investment in the possibility without any structural commitment that would require them to actually follow through. It looks like reaching out at specifically vulnerable moments, not because they tracked your calendar and identified when you would be most susceptible, but because the avoidance system is, after extended absence, most likely to move toward contact when their own defenses are temporarily lowered, late at night, on significant dates, in moments of their own loneliness or difficulty. And those moments happen to correspond, often, with moments of your own vulnerability. The contact lands when you are least armored against it, and it looks like just enough emotional authenticity to be undeniable, because the feeling behind the contact is real. The avoidant reaching out is not performing. They genuinely feel something in that moment. The missing, the pull toward what was between you, the weight of the absence that has been accumulating. The contact is an authentic expression of a real feeling. It just is not a commitment. It is not a decision. It is not the beginning of something different. It is the feeling finding its way out of the defended interior for a moment, without the underlying architecture having changed at all. That combination, real feeling, no structural change, is the most confusing thing a person can receive from someone they have been attached to. Because the realness of the feeling is undeniable. You can feel it. It is not fabricated. And so the natural response is to treat it as evidence that the situation is moving, that something has shifted, that this time is different. The question worth asking, before that hope fully takes hold, is different from what you have been asking before. The question that actually matters, most people in this situation are asking, do they still have feelings for me? And the answer to that question, as has been established, is almost certainly yes. The feelings are real, the pull is real, the missing is real. None of that was ever genuinely in question. The question that actually determines what you do next is this: has anything changed in the architecture? Not the feeling, the architecture, the underlying psychological structure that produced the distance in the first place, the nervous system that reads intimacy as threat, the deactivating strategies that fire when closeness reaches a certain threshold, the fundamental capacity or current lack of capacity to sustain the kind of singular, present, non-distributed investment that a real relationship requires. Because feelings without architectural change produce the same outcome every time. The return happens. The warmth reactivates. The connection resumes at something close to where it was. And then the intimacy builds back to the point where it last triggered the alarm response. And the alarm fires again. And the distance returns. And you are back at the beginning of a cycle you have already been through. Except now you are more depleted, more confused, more convinced that something is wrong with you specifically, rather than with the dynamic structurally. Architectural change is not invisible. It does not hide. It shows up in specific, observable behavioral ways that are distinct from the feeling and distinct from the warmth and distinct from the genuineness of the contact. It shows up in accountability, in the avoidant being able to acknowledge directly and without extensive reframing that they created distance and that the distance had an impact and that they understand what drove it in themselves. Not a performance of accountability. The real thing, uncomfortable, specific, not wrapped in justifications that subtly shift the responsibility. It shows up in consistency that does not require management, not in one interaction. Over time, the slow accumulating evidence of someone who is showing up in the same way repeatedly without needing to be carefully handled into it or strategically responded to in ways that prevent the retreat. It shows up in the willingness to be in a difficult conversation without deflecting, intellectualizing, or creating distance as a response to the discomfort of it. To stay present with something emotionally complex rather than exiting through one of the avoidant's usual escape routes. And it shows up in the thing that is rarest and most telling of all, the willingness to name what this is, to give the connection a real definition, rather than keeping it in the comfortable ambiguity that allows maximum flexibility and minimum accountability. To say clearly, this is what I want, this is what I am offering, this is what I am asking for, in a way that creates real exposure and real stakes. Warmth without those things is the hook. Those things in the presence of warmth are something worth considering. Why you are vulnerable to the hook right now, not as a criticism, as information, because understanding what is making you susceptible to it is the only way to respond to it from a position of genuine clarity rather than from the cocktail of hope and longing and relief that the reappearance tends to produce. You have been in the grief of this, the real grief, the specific, embodied, daily experience of the absence of someone who mattered to you. And grief has a particular effect on the nervous system that is worth understanding in this context. It lowers the threshold. It makes the arrival of warmth from the source of the grief disproportionately powerful. The relief of the absence ending, even temporarily, even ambiguously, lands with a force that is not proportional to what is actually being offered. It is proportional to how much the absence cost. This means that the minimum viable contact, the just enough message, the casual reappearance, the warmth without commitment, lands on you with the full weight of everything you have been carrying in the silence. It does not arrive as what it objectively is, which is a small thing. It arrives as the ending of the pain, as the answer to the question the absence kept asking, as the return of something you have been living without and did not want to live without. That landing is powerful enough to override a significant amount of what you know, to temporarily suspend the clarity that was built in the silence, to make the just enough feel like more than enough, because more than enough is what you have been hoping for, and the nervous system, flooded with relief, is not immediately interested in the distinction. Knowing this is happening does not prevent it from happening. The nervous system does not respond to intellectual awareness, but it gives you a window, a small but real window, between the feeling and the response, a moment in which you can acknowledge what is being activated in you without immediately acting from it, in which you can feel the pull of the hook without immediately being pulled. That window is where your clarity lives, and what you do in that window determines everything about what happens next. The empowered response, what it is and what it is not. When the avoidant comes back, whether it is happening now or whether it is coming, there is a response that serves you and a response that serves the hook. And they are not what most people assume they are. The response that serves the hook is either extreme. On one end, the immediate full reopening, the flood of warmth and relief, and the resumption of everything, as if the distance never happened, as if nothing needs to be addressed, as if the return itself is sufficient resolution of everything the departure created. On the other end, the performative coldness, the strategic withholding designed to make them feel the consequence of the distance, to make them chase, to rebalance the power dynamic through managed unavailability. Both of these serve the hook. The immediate reopening confirms that the hook worked, that the minimum viable contact was sufficient to restore full access, that no architectural change was necessary to return to the warmth. The performative coldness keeps the dynamic running on the same terms, strategic, managed, organized around their behavior rather than your genuine internal state. The response that serves you is neither of those. It is something quieter and more difficult and more genuinely powerful than either extreme. It is warm but unhurried, present but not reorganized around their return, genuinely open to what this might become if it becomes something real, while being equally genuinely clear, internally and eventually externally, about what real means and what you are no longer available for. It does not flood, it does not withhold. It simply meets them at the temperature they arrive at without exceeding it, matches the smallness of the re-entry without making the smallness a permanent ceiling, remains open to expansion while watching, actually watching, with the eyes of someone who now knows what architectural change looks like and what the absence of it looks like, for the evidence that determines what this actually is. That response requires something from you that the grief and the relief and the longing will actively resist. It requires you to stay connected to yourself while reconnecting with them, to keep one hand on the thread of who you have become in the silence, while the other hand tentatively reaches toward what is being offered, to be genuinely present in the moment without losing yourself inside it. That is the whole thing, right there. Stay connected to yourself, not as strategy, not as self-protection that is really just fear wearing a sophisticated outfit, but as the genuine, lived expression of someone who went through what you went through in the silence and came out of it with a relationship to yourself that is now primary, that does not get suspended in the presence of someone whose warmth you have been missing, that travels with you into the re-entry and stays present throughout it. That version of you, connected to yourself, warm but unhurried, clear about what you need without being defensive about needing it, is not someone the hook works on in the old way, not because you are guarded, but because you are grounded. And grounded people do not get pulled by hooks. They feel the pull and they stay where they are, and they watch what happens next with the patient, clear-eyed attention of someone who knows the difference between the feeling and the architecture. And what happens next, what they do in response to that groundedness, whether they rise to meet it or retreat from it, tells you everything you need to know about whether this return is the hook or something genuinely different. Watch what happens next. That is the whole instruction. Everything else follows from it. Watch what happens next. That instruction sounds simple because watching requires stillness. And stillness, when someone you have been missing is suddenly present again, is one of the hardest things a human nervous system is capable of. Everything in you wants to move, wants to close the distance, wants to take the warmth being offered and run with it back toward the version of things that existed before the distance, or further, toward the version that was always promised and never quite arrived. The watching feels like withholding, like you are deliberately suppressing something natural and real in the name of a strategic patience that is just another kind of game. It is not a game, and it is not withholding. It is the most honest thing you can do in this moment, because moving at the speed of the relief, before the evidence has had time to show you what this actually is not love. It is hunger, and hunger is not a reliable guide to what is actually good for you. So you watch, and here is specifically what you are watching for. The difference between return and re-entry. These are not the same thing, and the distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. A return is the avoidant coming back to the hook, coming back to the connection as it was, with the same structure, the same ceiling, the same deactivating strategies available and ready to fire the moment intimacy reaches the threshold that previously triggered the retreat. A return feels like resolution because the absence ends, but it is not resolution, it is resumption. The same dynamic resumed from approximately the same point, heading toward the same eventual outcome. A re-entry is something different. A re-entry is the avoidant coming back to something they have genuinely reckoned with, coming back with the specific, uncomfortable, self-confrontational awareness of what they did and what drove it and what it cost, not just you, but them, coming back not to resume, but to try differently, with some evidence, however early and however incomplete, that the trying differently is grounded in actual internal work rather than in the temporary remorse that the reckoning produces before the defense system reasserts itself. The difference between these two things is not always immediately visible. In the first days and weeks of a recontact, a return and a re-entry can look almost identical on the surface. Both involve warmth. Both involve the avoidant reaching towards you. Both feel, to the nervous system flooded with relief, like the thing you have been hoping for. The difference emerges over time in the consistency or inconsistency of what follows, in whether the warmth maintains itself or begins the familiar cycle of advance and retreat, in whether the accountability that appeared in the early moments of recontact deepens and sustains or quietly evaporates once the immediate vulnerability of reaching out has passed, in whether they can stay in the discomfort of real conversation, or whether the deflection and the intellectualizing and the creation of distance as a response to emotional demand begins again. Time tells the truth, which means your job in the early period of recontact is not to decide what this is. It is to stay present without deciding, to remain genuinely open without collapsing back into the old dynamic before you have evidence of what kind of return this actually is. That sustained openness without collapse, that is the hardest stance there is in this situation, and it is the only one that gives you accurate information. What the avoidant is experiencing when they come back, because understanding their interior in this moment is not about making excuses for them. It is about reading the situation accurately. And reading it accurately requires knowing what is actually happening on their end, rather than projecting either the best case or the worst case onto what is often something significantly more complicated than either. When an avoidant returns after a genuine reckoning, after the accumulating absence has done the work described earlier, after the story that justified the distance has developed enough cracks to become untenable, they are not arriving in a state of resolution. They are arriving in a state of conflict. The part that drove the reckoning, the part that feels the missing, that registers the real cost of what was pushed away, that has been losing the argument with the defense system for however long the separation lasted. That part is in the ascendant in this moment. It is what produced the contact. It is why they are here. But the defense system is not gone. It did not dismantle itself during the reckoning. It is present, active, and watching the recontact with the same vigilance it has always had, waiting for evidence that the intimacy will reach the threshold that previously triggered the alarm, waiting for the pressure, the demand, the emotional intensity that it learned to treat as threatening, ready to reassert itself the moment the vulnerability of recontact produces the conditions it recognizes as dangerous. This means the avoidant returning is simultaneously moving toward you and braced against the consequences of moving toward you, both things at once, which produces a quality of presence that is real but tentative, warm but watchful, reaching and ready to retract simultaneously. Your response to this matters enormously, not because you are responsible for managing their defense system. You are not, and you never were, but because the quality of what you bring to this early recontact either confirms the defense system's fears or disconfirms them, either provides the evidence it is looking for to justify reassertion or fails to provide that evidence and creates a window in which something different becomes possible. Providing that evidence does not require you to do anything dramatic or overwhelming. It just requires you to be present in the way that the old dynamic was characterized by. The anxious, monitoring, needs, confirmation, organized around their comfort presence that the avoidance system learned to recognize as the precursor to the pressure it retreats from. Not providing that evidence requires you to be the version of yourself that was built in the silence, grounded, genuinely okay, warm without being consuming, present without being organized around their comfort, real without being a demand. That version of you does not confirm the defense system's predictions. And when the defense system's predictions fail to materialize, something interesting happens. The vigilance softens, not immediately, not completely, but incrementally, in the specific, gradual way that new experience begins to override old expectation. That overriding is what earned security looks like in practice, not a declaration, not a single transformative moment. The slow accumulation of experiences that fail to confirm the oldest fears, and your groundedness, your genuine, non-performed, non-strategic groundedness, is what makes those experiences possible. The conversation that has to happen, at some point, if this recontact continues and the warmth sustains, and there is genuine evidence of something more than just the hook being reactivated, at some point, there is a conversation that has to happen. Not immediately, not in the first flush of recontact when everything is tentative and the defense system is at its most vigilant, but eventually, before the connection rebuilds to a depth that makes the absence of this conversation a structural problem. The conversation is not a confrontation. It is not the full accounting of everything that happened delivered at maximum emotional intensity. It is not the flood of accumulated feeling that has been waiting for an outlet finally finding one. It is a simple, clear, honest exchange about what this is and what both people are actually bringing to it. Not what they feel. Feelings have been established. Feelings were never the question. What they are willing to do. What has changed specifically in how they are approaching this? What they understand now that they did not understand before about themselves and about what the connection requires, and what you need, simply stated, without the history attached, without the full weight of everything that preceded this moment, in order to be genuinely in this, rather than in the suspended, neither here nor there, state that characterized too much of the before. That conversation requires courage from both of you, from them, because initiating real accountability is terrifying for someone whose defense system has spent decades ensuring that vulnerability is minimized. From you, because stating clearly what you need, without over-explaining, without flooding, without immediately softening it in response to their discomfort, requires a confidence in your own deservingness that this dynamic has historically made difficult to maintain. But the conversation is not optional. A connection that resumes without it is a connection that is pretending the history does not exist. And pretending the history does not exist means the history is still operating underneath everything, shaping the dynamic, generating the same patterns, heading toward the same outcome. While the surface presents as something new, the conversation makes the history explicit, acknowledged, something that both people have looked at directly and decided to move forward from rather than around. And that directness, that shared acknowledgement of what happened and what is being chosen instead, is the foundation on which something genuinely different can be built. Without it, there is no foundation, just the resumption of something that already showed you where it goes. When the avoidant cannot meet you there, because this has to be addressed, because the empowerment this whole conversation has been building toward is not only about how to respond if the return is real, it is equally about what you do if it is not. If the recontact is the hook, if what returns is warmth without accountability, feeling without architectural change, the minimum viable contact that reactivates your investment without providing anything substantive in return, then the empowered response is the hardest and most necessary thing you will do in this entire situation. You name it, not with anger, not with the accumulated weight of everything that preceded it, just clearly, directly, in the specific, unambiguous way of someone who knows what they are looking at and is no longer willing to pretend otherwise. Something like, I feel the pull of this. I know what we had was real, and I also know what the pattern has been, and I am not available to re-enter the pattern. If something has genuinely changed, if you have done real work on what drove the distance and you are here to try differently, I am genuinely open to that conversation. But I need to know that is what this is, because I am not able to keep living in the ambiguity of something that has enough warmth to maintain my investment, but not enough commitment to actually be a relationship. That is not an ultimatum. It is a clarity statement. It is you, with full knowledge of the pattern and full respect for your own investment and full understanding of what you actually need, stating where you are and what you are available for. What they do with that statement is the final, definitive information. If they can receive it, if they can stay in the discomfort of that directness, without deflecting or retreating or reframing it as pressure, then there is something real to work with. If the statement produces the familiar withdrawal, the sudden need for space, the reframing of your clarity as a demand they cannot meet, then the defense system has just told you everything you needed to know about whether this return was the hook or something genuinely different. Either way, you have your answer. And having your answer, even when the answer is not the one you hoped for, is always better than the indefinite suspension of not knowing, because not knowing is where the hook lives, and clarity, however painful, is where your life resumes. What you are actually building toward, not with them necessarily, with yourself, with the version of connection that this entire arc has been clarifying for you. You are building toward a relationship, whether it is this one transformed or a different one entirely, that does not require you to monitor and manage and calibrate and brace. That does not have a ceiling that never moves or a warmth that resets every time it reaches something real. That does not ask you to earn your place repeatedly in something that should simply be yours because you chose each other and you both keep choosing. That relationship is not a fantasy. It is not the naive hope of someone who does not understand the complexity of human attachment. It is the entirely reasonable expectation of someone who has done enough work on understanding this dynamic, on understanding themselves inside it, on building the groundedness that makes genuine connection possible, to know exactly what they are worth and exactly what love is supposed to feel like at its foundation. You are worth consistency. You are worth a ceiling that moves. You are worth future plans that become real. You are worth being the point, not one of several ongoing investments, not the occupant of an allocated portion, but the person, chosen clearly, chosen repeatedly, in the daylight, without ambiguity, without the strategic maintenance of just enough distance to keep the hook in place. That is not too much. That is the minimum. And knowing it is the minimum, feeling it is the minimum rather than as an aspirational standard you are reaching toward, is the shift that everything in this has been building toward. The avoidant psychology that keeps you hooked is real. The patterns are real. The hook is real. And now you see it clearly, not just intellectually, but in the specific embodied way of someone who has felt it from the inside and can name every part of it. That seeing changes everything, not because it makes the feeling go away, but because you cannot be pulled by something you can see clearly. You can feel the pull and stay grounded simultaneously. You can be warm and open and genuinely available for something real while being completely, quietly, unshakably clear about what real means and what you will no longer accept in its absence. That combination, open and clear at the same time, is not something the hook was designed to encounter. It was designed for the version of you that existed before all of this, the version that could be maintained in suspended hope by the minimum viable warmth. That version is gone. What is here now is someone who knows exactly what they are looking at, who knows the difference between the feeling and the architecture, who can hold genuine warmth for this person alongside genuine clarity about what is and is not available from them right now, and who, whatever happens next, is no longer organized around the outcome. That is not the end of the story. That is the beginning of the only version of it worth being in. You know what you are looking at now. You have the framework, the signs, the psychology, the specific language for every part of the pattern that was previously just a feeling you could not name. You have the groundedness, the clarity, the understanding of what the hook is and how it works and why you were vulnerable to it and what the empowered response looks like. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet voice is saying, okay, but what do I actually do tomorrow? Not in the abstract, not in the framework, unglamorous reality of Tuesday morning when the phone is in your hand and there is a message from them sitting there and everything you know is competing with everything you feel, and the gap between the two is exactly where the old pattern used to live. That gap, that is where this conversation is going now, into the practical, into the daily, into the specific texture of what it actually looks like to live inside this clarity rather than just understand it. Because understanding without application is just information, and information alone does not change behavior. Only practice changes behavior. Only the repeated, daily, sometimes failing and trying again act of responding differently than you used to respond, from a different internal place toward a different outcome, actually rewires the pattern. So let's talk about the practice. The morning the message arrives, it will not arrive at a convenient time. It will not arrive when you are feeling grounded and clear and fully resourced. It will arrive when you are tired or lonely or in the middle of something else entirely, and the notification will appear and something will shift in your chest before your conscious mind has even fully registered what you are looking at. That shift, that immediate, involuntary, full-body response to their name appearing on your screen is not a sign that you have not healed enough. It is not evidence that all the work was wasted. It is a conditioned response to a stimulus that your nervous system has a long and loaded history with. It will happen regardless of how much you understand, regardless of how grounded you have become, regardless of how clearly you can see the hook and name the pattern and articulate exactly what you are and are not available for. What matters is not whether the shift happens. It will. What matters is what you do in the 30 seconds after it happens. Do not respond immediately. Not as strategy, not to create the impression of a busy, unbothered life, but because the 30 seconds after that notification arrives is precisely when your nervous system is least equipped to respond from your actual values, rather than from the conditioned hunger that the stimulus reactivated. The flood of neurochemical response that the contact produces needs a moment to settle before your prefrontal cortex, the part that knows what you know, that has done the work, that understands the difference between the hook and something real, can actually participate in what happens next. Put the phone down, literally, not forever, for long enough to take 3 full breaths and reconnect with the person you have been building in the silence, rather than the person who used to reach back immediately from the place of relief and hunger. Then read it. Read it once, not 10 times, passing every word for subtext and hidden meaning and the specific emotional temperature of each sentence. Once, for what it actually says rather than for everything you hope it might mean underneath what it says. And then ask yourself one question before you respond. One question only. Is this the hook, or is this something different? Not based on hope, based on evidence, based on everything you now know about what architectural change looks like versus what the minimum viable contact that maintains the hook looks like, based on the specific content of the specific message measured against those specific criteria. If it is the hook, warm, feeling laden, real in its emotion but absent of anything that constitutes genuine accountability or structural change, then your response is warm, brief, and unhurried. Not cold, not punishing, not the performative distance that is just the hook's mirror image, simply present at the same temperature they arrived at, nothing more. If it carries something different, if there is genuine accountability in it, real acknowledgement of what happened, actual substance beneath the warmth, then it deserves more. Not immediately, not in a flood, but with the genuine, open, grounded presence of someone who recognizes something real when it arrives and is willing to meet it where it is. The distinction between those two responses is everything, and you now have the framework to make it accurately. The week that follows first contact, because a single message does not tell you what this is. A single interaction never does. What tells you what this is the week that follows? The pattern that emerges when the initial contact has had time to either develop into something or reveal itself as the hook reasserting its minimum maintenance. Watch the consistency, not demanding consistency, watching for it. Is the contact sustained, or does it arrive in a burst and then recede back into the managed distance that characterized the before? Does the warmth maintain itself across multiple interactions, or does it appear in the initial recontact and then quietly dial back once your investment has been sufficiently reactivated? Watch the depth. Does each interaction build on the previous one in the natural accumulating way of two people genuinely reconnecting? Or does each interaction feel somewhat self-contained, warm within its moment, but not visibly adding to a developing foundation, not building toward the conversation that eventually has to happen about what this actually is and what both people are genuinely bringing to it? Watch what they do with space, not the space you create strategically, but the natural space of two people reconnecting. Carefully, do they tolerate it without immediately receding behind it? Can they be in the uncertainty of something unresolved and still reach toward you rather than retreating from the discomfort of it? Or does any reduction in your immediate responsiveness produce the familiar pattern of distance following distance, the avoidance system interpreting your unavailability as confirmation that closeness leads to the thing it has always feared? And watch yourself, because the week that follows first contact is also when your own patterns will reassert themselves most strongly. The monitoring will want to resume. The calibration will want to begin again, adjusting your responses, managing your availability, shape-shifting toward whatever version of yourself seems most likely to keep them present. The old reflexes do not disappear just because you understand them. They wait for exactly this moment to offer themselves as familiar, well-worn solutions to the anxiety that recontact produces. Notice when you are doing it, not with self-judgment, with simple, clear observation. There it is, the old pattern, reaching for the old tools because the new situation activated the old fear. And then, not always perfectly, not without effort, choosing differently, choosing the grounded response over the managed one, the honest presence over the calibrated performance. That choosing, repeated imperfectly over days and weeks, is how new patterns actually form. Not in a single moment of clarity, in the accumulation of small, daily, often difficult choices to respond from the person you have become, rather than the person this dynamic historically made you. The conversation about what this is, it will become necessary if the recontact sustains itself past the initial warmth of reunion. If the consistency holds and the depth develops and the evidence begins to accumulate that this might be something genuinely different, the conversation will become necessary. Not as a confrontation you initiate with a rehearsed speech, as a natural emergence from the accumulating reality of two people who are clearly moving toward each other, but have not yet named what they are moving toward. At some point, the unspoken becomes louder than the spoken. At some point, continuing without addressing it becomes its own kind of dishonesty. When that point arrives, and you will feel it, the same way you felt all the other things your gut was accurately reading throughout this, here is how you bring it. Simply, without the full history attached, without the flood of everything that accumulated during the separation, without the implicit demand that they account for every moment of the distance before being allowed back in. Something like, I want to talk about what this is, not to pressure anything into a definition it is not ready for, but because I have done enough work on myself through all of this to know that I am not available for something undefined indefinitely. I care about what is happening here, and caring about it means being honest about what I need it to be. Then stop and let them respond. What they do in that moment, whether they can stay in the conversation or whether the familiar deflection begins, whether they can meet the directness with their own or whether the vulnerability of being asked to define something produces the retreat, that is your clearest possible information about where this actually is. If they can stay, if they can be honest about what they are feeling and what they want and what they are genuinely offering, even imperfectly, even with the tentativeness of someone who is learning to be in this kind of conversation for the first time, then there is something real to work with, something worth the patience and the careful, unrushed building that follows. If the conversation produces the retreat, if the directness triggers the defense system, and the warmth recedes and the distance returns in its familiar form, then the conversation did something valuable anyway. It gave you the clearest possible answer to the question you have been sitting with, not the answer you hoped for, but an answer, a real one, the kind that closes the loop rather than leaving it indefinitely open. And a closed loop, even a painful one, is always better than the open one that keeps you suspended in a hope that cannot go anywhere. If it is real, what building it actually looks like, because the empowerment here is not only about protecting yourself from the hook, it is equally about knowing what to do if what returns is actually something different. If the evidence accumulates in the direction of genuine change, if the architectural shift is real and visible and sustained over the time that reveals what single moments cannot, building it looks like patience that is not the same as the old waiting. The old waiting was organized around them, around their readiness, their timeline, their pace of becoming available. This patience is organized around reality, around the actual evidence of what is developing and what is not, around the willingness to let something genuine grow at the speed it actually grows, rather than forcing it toward the depth and commitment you are ready for before the foundation can support it. It looks like maintaining yourself throughout, keeping the life you built in the silence, running alongside the reconnection, rather than subordinating it to the relationship the moment the relationship resumes. Keeping your friendships, your investments, your forward momentum, not as proof of independence, not to perform unbotheredness, but because those things are genuinely yours now, and they do not get paused every time someone re-enters your life. They continue. Because you continue. Because you are primary in your own life now in a way that you were not before. It looks like saying what is true when something is not working, not in floods, in the simple, clean, present tense way of someone who trusts themselves enough to name their experience without requiring the other person to validate it before it counts as real. Something feels off. This is not working for me. I need something different here, said once, clearly, without the full history attached, and then watched. What do they do with it? Can they receive it? Can they respond to it without retreating from the discomfort of it? And it looks like genuine celebration of what works. Because not everything in this needs to be vigilance and watching and measuring against criteria. If the consistency is real, if the warmth maintains and the depth develops, and the ceiling begins to move, and the resets stop, and the future plans start having actual weight, then let yourself feel that, not with the terrified, braced against loss quality of someone who has been here before and is waiting for the other shoe to drop, but with the open, present, genuinely inhabited quality of someone who has done enough work to receive good things without immediately converting them into anxiety about when they will end. That receiving, the ability to be genuinely inside something good rather than hovering above it, watching for signs of its demise, is the final piece of the work. And it is only available to the version of you that has actually done everything that preceded it. The grief, the clarity, the groundedness, the practice of responding differently, the willingness to name what is true. All of it leads here, to the ability to be present in something real without the old fear running underneath it at full volume. You came into all of this with a feeling you could not name, a pattern you were inside without being able to see its edges, a dynamic that was costing you in ways you felt but could not fully articulate. You are leaving it with something different. Not certainty about how the specific situation resolves. That was never within your control, and it still is not, but something more durable than certainty. Something that travels with you regardless of what they do or do not do, regardless of whether the return is real or the hook, regardless of whether this particular story gets the ending you hoped for. You are leaving it with yourself. The specific, hard-won, experientially grounded version of yourself that knows what the pattern looks like from the inside. That can feel the pull of the hook without being pulled. That can be warm and open and genuinely available for something real while being completely clear about what real means. That responds from groundedness rather than hunger. That stays connected to itself even in the presence of the person whose absence cost the most. That version of you is not who you were when this started. That version of you is what this built. And what this built, whatever it cost, however long it took, however many times the old pattern reasserted itself before the new one took hold, is yours, permanently, unconditionally, independent of any outcome you do not control. Nobody can hook what is fully grounded. Remember that on Tuesday morning when the phone is in your hand, on the days when the clarity wavers and the longing is louder than the knowing, on the ordinary, unglamorous days when the work of being who you have become feels less like empowerment and more like just getting through. Remember it then most of all. You are not who you were, and who you are now knows exactly what to do.